And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Greetings, I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook on this Thursday, August 15th, 2024. Starting with the sea ice, we have the ice melting off here along the Beaufort Sea coastline, especially just north there of Prudhoe Bay, and that will continue here through the very end of summer and early autumn. Along the Russian Arctic coast, there's a fair amount of ice that's been able to accumulate and still be in that location. And it should continue to gradually melt off as well. But we are going to have three potential systems working their way across this region of the state. The first low will be coming onshore around Nome, 4 a.m. Friday morning and tracking up to Utqiagvik by late afternoon, early evening. And then another storm will take a similar track later Saturday into early Sunday. So looking at the weather maps, here's the way things are looking late tonight, early on Friday morning. The first low crossing there, the Seward Peninsula near Nome with gusty winds and rain. And a weak secondary low just on the north side of Kodiak Island. This has been a pretty mild push of air. Some gusty winds along the Alaska range. We still have high surf advisories in effect along areas of Norton Sound, especially from Golovin down through Shaktoolik, Unalakleet, down to the Yukon Delta coastline. And then further west, here comes the second storm. So that by Friday afternoon, the front presses further eastward toward the eastern interior. The secondary low here just kind of weakens, but this is going to become the next main low, crossing the western half of the Aleutians with gale force winds. And as that rides northeastward on Saturday, it'll be located taking a similar track with this frontal system moving inland. Going to have some gusty, brisk southerly gales that will cause the potential for some minor coastal flooding, especially on the north side of Kuskokwim Bay Saturday into early Sunday. And the water will tend to pile up there. We also have some moderate to locally heavier rains, and we have elevation with that southerly flow enhancing the rain. Areas around Nome, Golovin, especially the higher terrain up from there, could see as much as 2 to 4 inches of rain now through Sunday afternoon. So looking at Friday's weather, the place to be is in the Panhandle. Ridge of high pressure still bringing mostly clear to partly cloudy skies, warm temperatures, 60s and 70s, south wind 10 knots within Lynn Canal, 2-foot waves, northwest winds 10 to 15 knots, Stevens Passage, Dixon Entrance, waves 2 to 3 feet. The outer coast, northwest winds 25 to 20 knots off of Craig and south of Sitka, swells there 7 to 8 feet, westerly winds west of Sitka outside of Gustavus at 15 knots, and then as you get up to Cape Suckling, winds flip around to the east at 20 knots with 4 5-foot swells. For Saturday, south winds continue 10 knots, 2-foot waves there within Lynn Canal. Northwest winds 10 knots, Stevens Passage, and then up to 20 knots there through Dixon Entrance with waves there as high as 3 feet. For the outer coast, generally northwest winds 10 to 15 knots outside of Yakutat Bay to off of Sitka and Craig, swells 4 to 5 feet, but more westerly winds out toward Cape Suckling. And for Friday, outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance, look for east to southeast winds at 25 knots. Within Prince William Sound, east winds to 20 knots with waves at 4 feet. Brisk winds out through middle Cook Inlet. We're looking at south-southwest winds 20 to 25 knots with waves anchor point up to Kenai 6 to 7 feet. And then Saturday, we have variable winds just outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance and off the Kenai coast at 10 knots. Northwest winds to 10 knots in Prince William Sound. And upper Cook Inlet, southwest winds 20 knots, 5-foot waves. The lower Cook Inlet, though, we'll see southeast winds at the entrance, upwards of 25 knots with swells of 5 to 7 feet. On Friday, Kodiak Island winds will be southwest 20 to 25 knots, waves 6 feet within Shelikof Strait. And then generally southwest winds along the upper middle portion of the peninsula, turning southerly 20 to 25 knots there north of Cold Bay. Swells 5 to 7 feet on the North Pacific side and 5 to 7 feet on the Bering side. For Saturday, southwest winds 20 knots around Kodiak Island. They're going to go back southeast to south and increase to 30 to 35 knot gales, especially as you get down past Sand Point to Cold Bay and False Pass. Swells building 9 to 14 feet there off of False Pass and Sand Point. On the Bering side, we're looking at waves of 5 to 6 feet. For the Aleutians on Friday, strongest winds are going to be Nikolsky through Atka. We're looking at southeasterly gales to 45 knots ahead of the next low center that'll be crossing up through the western Aleutians. And on the east, the north side of that, as that low is going to be passing through Kiska, initially east winds to 25 knots, but they'll flip around to the west-southwest once that low tracks further northeastward up into the Bering Sea. Come Saturday, the low center is located further north, so ahead of it, south to southwest wind, 35 knot southerly gales around Unalaska, becoming more southwesterly, 30 knots Nikolsky through Atka and Adak, and then westerly west of Adak and northwesterly 25 to 30 knots Kiska towards Shemya. And for the southwest coast, 25 knot southwest winds into Bristol Bay, west winds of 30 knots there within Kuskokwim Bay, 30 knot south winds Pribilof Islands with swells 7-8 feet, west winds to 25 knots St. Matthew, and then along the lower Yukon coast up into Norton Sound, especially this wider expanse between Stebbins and Nome. We're looking at west to southwest gales, 35 knots, and waves 7 feet. Come Saturday with the next system, south winds of 30 knots into Bristol Bay and Kuskokwim Bay, and locally some higher gusts. This is going to cause a potential for some minor coastal flooding, especially here on the north side of Kuskokwim Bay as we go Saturday into Sunday. Further west, looks southeast gales to 35 knots around St. Matthew with 11-foot swells. And further north, look for south winds along the lower Yukon coast, 20 to 25 knots. 25 knot easterly winds there out of Norton Sound. That's temporary until the next low gets further north, and then those winds will go south and eventually southwesterly. So areas that are going to be through the Bering Strait and on the north side of St. Lawrence Island, the west side of the Seward Peninsula, northwest gales to 35 knots, and we're looking at swells of right around 8-9 feet. As we go up the Chukchi Sea, we're looking at north winds 25 to 30 knots, Wainwright south through Point Hope. And then up along the Arctic coast, easterly winds to 15 knots Utqiagvik, but southerly winds, that's that downslope offshore flow off of the eastern half of the north slope, Prudhoe Bay to Kaktovik with 3-foot waves. And then on Saturday, winds turn westerly along the Arctic coast as high as 30 knots near Kaktovik. And as we drop down through the Chukchi Sea, winds generally west to southwest, Utqiagvik through Cape Lisburne at about 10 to 15 knots. But then Point Hope to the north side of the Bering Strait, 15 to 20 knot easterly winds. And then once we get south of the Bering Strait, off of the Seward Peninsula and in through the north side of St. Lawrence Island, we're looking at easterly winds 20 to 25 knots with waves of 4 to as high as 7 feet.